Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are this week that actually took on a whole new meaning. I was traveled internationally this week. I flew to Europe and I spent the day in Amsterdam. So it was really confusing changing so many time zones, first from New York to there and then to Israel. I believe I prayed the cycle uh, in airports. At least two chakras and a musaf, a mariv and a mincha, something along the way. It was a very long trip. So you'll forgive me if I have not been online in quite a while, and also if I am a little bit tired. But it's exciting because this week we get to Parashat Zachor, which has always special meaning to me. Years ago, I first read Tetzavveh, this week's Parsha on Zachor. Well, at least I read the latter half. My younger brother was a very smart boy. I was a smart guy. And he did not feel the need to prepare his entire parsha, just like they do here in Israel. It's, what does he need to do that for? He read nicely, and then I took over for him. So I always remember this falls out. This is actually a quite common occurrence. And since then, I've always wondered perhaps there's a connection between these two parshas. We're not going to talk about Tetzavveh so much today. We're going to talk about Zachor. Zachor is the yearly reading that allows us to fulfill the biblical commandment to remember Amalek. There is a commandment to do so. And as the Vilna Gaon points out, it's a misnomer to say that this is the one commandment, the one Torah reading that's actually a biblical commandment. No, it's the Torah reading that helps us satisfy a biblical commandment. There's no Torah reading that we do as part of our cycle or in the regular synagogue service that is actually a biblical commandment. It's always a rabbinic enactment, even if that rabbinic enactment is from Moses himself. And of course, there's the biblical commandment to read the Torah on Hakel, but that's once every 7 years. It's not in the synagogue. That's a special reading. So we're not talking about that. Then we read the Haftarah. The Haftarah talks about how at a certain point in history, when the Jewish people had their first king, and once his kingdom was fully established, he was bidden by the prophet Samuel. We're talking about Saul, first king, Jewish, first Israelite king, Jewish, Dafka not Jewish, because eventually the tribe of Judah chose themselves another king before the rest of Israel caught on. The prophet Samuel told Saul that as part of his job as prophet, is the prophet who appointed him as king is to tell him that his job as king is to destroy the Amalekites. As we pointed out in years past, this was not a war of aggression. Many people, the naysayers, like to point to the biblical commandment to destroy or wipe out the memory of Amalek as a sign of biblical, or as I say, Old Testament brutality, which it is not. There is no commandment to commit genocide. There's a commandment to defend oneself from possible genocide. And in this case, Amalek represents those who would want to kill the Jewish people, destroy the Jewish people. It even says shortly before this, people skip this chapter, it says that Saul made war with all the surrounding nations. Basically, they should finally back off and stop oppressing his people. And then it says, especially he fought Amalek. He rescued Israel from those who would despoil them. That is, Amalek was a constant thorn in Israel's side. And also Agag was, before his execution, they told him, you're gonna know what bereavement feels like. And he sort of agreed with that. He knew what was coming. He said he wasn't even afraid of his own death anymore because he knew he got what he deserved. And I'd like to point out that this week we have to say much for Saul's character, because as far as piety, what we call as far as his individual character, not as a king, but as a person, and then sort of as a king, Saul was head and shoulders above. Literally, he was head and shoulders above the people, but he was also spiritually head and shoulders above his contemporaries, and perhaps also throughout history, he was head and shoulders above everybody else. Saul was a great person. This is in line with the Torah of Rabbi Victor Miller. We have to wonder, why was Samuel so distressed when God told him that Saul did wrong? What did Saul do wrong? Saul went and got the people. He counted them up, and he had them go fight the Amalekites. I asked Rav Schechter this question years ago, when I was 20 years ago. Why is it if Saul smote all of the Amalekites except for Agag, shortly thereafter we find David making war with Amalek, and it says that he killed everybody he could except 400 lads who were quick and escaped on camels. Obviously, there were survivors this time also, but whoever Saul could get, he killed. And it says that they caught Agag and they captured him alive, and that they also kept some of the spoils, and they were told to destroy everybody from man to woman, old man to child, and also all the animals, whether the pure ones, Mishorat Zeh, and also the impure animals. And they took home some of the spoils. And for that, Saul was held accountable by the divine court. And Samuel got the message that Saul had now been rejected. Previously, Samuel had told Saul that his kingdom would not last, which means that he wouldn't have a lasting dynasty. But it doesn't mean that Saul himself would be rejected or that his son wouldn't also get a chance to reign. But this time, Samuel was telling Saul, no, you are going to lose your kingdom. It will be given to someone else entirely. Re'acha, not your son. It means your peer, someone, his competitor. And we know that eventually was David. I'd like to say that between us as human beings, Saul did nothing wrong. Samuel was distressed because what would happen? Samuel was the one who the people, from whom the people requested a king. The people needed a king. So they came to Samuel. They said, find us a king. You're the prophet. We're supposed to ask God who to appoint. So please tell us, because you're God's representative. And Samuel showed them that here was Saul. And he said in God's name, this is the man who's supposed to be king. He's the chosen one. He anointed him officially. And the people had sort of rejected. It says that he wasn't fully accepted the first time. They were just wondering, so what do we do now? We have a king. There were people who outright rejected him. But then when Saul led the people in a national fight to protect the small town of Yavesh Gilad from the Ammonite oppressors, he led the entire Jewish people in that fight. And they saw that Saul is the right man. Saul was re-anointed, and they had a large ceremony to establish his kingdom. And that says they had basically what I saw one of the commentators, one of the English commentators, perhaps it was the Sonsino or it was the Judaica Press, I forget what. Years ago I read, they called the War of Independence from the Philistines. And in that war, we also learn about Saul's son, Jonathan, who is apparently his heir, and was also very popular among the people. And after that war, it says, Shaul lachadatam lucha. He took firm control of the kingdom. That is, the people were very fully behind Saul. He was their king. Saul was a tzaddik. Saul, as we see later, he got rid of all the necromancers. He enforced Torah law, and the people saw nothing wrong with this deeply religious man who was chosen. So Samuel had also said that a day would come when the people would beg God to remove their king because they would suffer under the king's oppression, his taxes, and all the demands that having a king would make on the people. So Samuel, who it says early in the book also, unique among all the prophets, Samuel, it says how he earned his reputation as a prophet from being a young man, and how he got reputation as a true prophet, and his words always came true. There's a big deal about that. The book is now faced with a crisis. Why? Samuel is now going to have to tell the people in God's name that this perfect king, who they had trouble accepting at the beginning, but now with whom they have no problem, is being rejected by God himself, and it's the prophet who has to deliver this. The same prophet who told them that they would one day reject their king is telling them now that this perfect tzaddik of a king has done something wrong and deserves to be rejected and replaced. If a navi, a prophet, ever says something that contradicts that which he had previously said, it gives an opportunity for the scoffers or even regular people to doubt the prophet's veracity. The prophet is not trustworthy. How can the prophet say, this is the chosen one, God said he should be your king, and now same prophet comes and says, no, he's not your king. It was just changed our minds. God doesn't do things like that. Now, if you're asking, so what do you mean? Didn't Saul not listen to God? I don't believe human beings would have noticed a thing like that. What was Saul's crime? He seized Agag. Really, God wanted the most extreme case here. He wanted even the king to be killed. We even see in the times of Joshua Perhaps this happened in Moses' time, in David's time, and other Jewish kings, and most especially explicitly in the book of Joshua, that Joshua had to destroy the Canaanites in battle. The same halacha, the same rule applies to them once you're fighting them. You have to eliminate all of them, men, women, and children. And it says that there were certain kings who were captured alive, and they were executed in order to make a statement, in order to make an example of them and strike fear in the hearts of the enemy. That was a perfectly normal thing. And you even see that Samuel went along with this. After Saul had his confessional with Samuel and accepted the decree, he asked Samuel to, save a little face with him and join him for the public execution of Agag. And Samuel complied. And Samuel himself took the high honor as God's emissary of killing. Somehow it says a unique verb there, vayishasef. We don't know exactly what it means. Perhaps it's from the word Aramaic word sword. He sliced them up in front of God. That means it was the right thing to do. He did it in an act of supreme holiness and religiosity. So most of us would have seen this and perhaps even praised Saul for his execution, the way he had conducted this war, and for capturing Agag, just to make a public spectacle of his execution. That was a good thing normally. That's what the greatest prophets had done. Also, taking from the spoils and dedicating it as a sacrifice, or dedicating toward the temple, making it holy, was something that we saw that people did in the time of Moses. Once again, Moses had been commanded, take 1,000 men from each tribe and thoroughly smite the Midianites. And there they had to kill all the males and even the females. And Moses even had to criticize the heads of those troops, the heads of the thousands. There were 12,000, so there are probably 12 of them, and the heads of the hundreds. So that would mean there were 120 of them. He had to tell them, you should have. How could you leave these people alive? You should have killed them all. But he did accept the spoils, especially the spoils that are given to God. And God even said that take a certain percentage, give that to the Levium, and another percentage and give that to the Kohen. And then it says that the captains themselves gave a special present to the tabernacle, also in honor of the amazing miracle that none of their men had fallen in battle. There were no casualties. And we see also David took a lot of spoils from his enemies and dedicated it to the temple, including that of the Amalekites, which when he fought them and 400 of them escaped, he then made a tribute. He made a tribute to all the major leaders of his own tribe of Judah. And there's even a song that accompanies it. It's the end of what we call the first book of Samuel. David saying, this is for the elders who live in Hormah and the elders who live in Bechorashan and all these other places. It was a perfectly normal thing. It was probably even a praiseworthy thing that the Jewish leaders, the greatest prophets, the greatest judges, the greatest kings, took of the spoils of the enemies, including the Amalekites, and dedicated that to God, made a special gift, a korban, whatever it is. So what Saul did was perfectly acceptable. And it is only in the eyes of the divine court, which has very exacting standards. Remember, the greater one is, the higher the standards he is held to which he is held. That's what happened. None of us could ever dare to say that we know that Saul did something wrong. Because indeed, Saul barely did anything wrong. Just God was holding him. He had to take this literally. Perhaps it was a hora'at sha'ah, a one-time prophetic message that had to be kept exactly. No, even Agag had to be killed in battle, not be taken as captive. And even if the people wanted to dedicate some of the spoils as sacrifice, not this time. And that's what Samuel actually had meant. And it's for this that Saul had to lose his kingdom. So this was something very difficult. This put Samuel in a crisis. That's why it says this bothered Samuel, or Samuel was greatly distressed, and he cried out to God in prayer all night long when he got this message. There's some who say it's because Samuel was Saul's mentor. It's not the Rebbe Talmud mentor or the father-son relationship that we see elsewhere. It's more of that Samuel was the prophet who had anointed him. It was a leadership relationship. Samuel was the man who had to guide him in his administration. Remember, Saul was a stranger to Samuel before Saul showed up in Samuel's town, and God said, "Here, I'm bringing you the one who you have to anoint." He did not raise him to be a king. He appointed him, and he guided him and directed him what to do. And the problem here now was that this message, this new development of Saul's rejection, could make desecration of God's name. The fact that Samuel would be contradicting that which he had said previously, that this chosen one was now rejected, and that Samuel himself would be the one to reject the king, and not the people of whom he had said that they would come to reject their king. And it's also ironic, David himself was not as popular king throughout his reign as Saul. Saul never had a popular rebellion against him. David had two of them, even from his own son. David, for a while, was not accepted by all the tribes when he was a king for 7 years over one tribe. And it's only then, when the tribes had no choice, that they joined up with him. But even then, there was always murmurings. You could read between the lines, and sometimes explicitly, that the arrangement was not as popular as, let's say, Saul's own reign over the Jewish people. This also explains why we have the strange and unfortunate circumstances of the end of Saul's reign. I indeed like the commentators who point out that it seems that Samuel reigned more than just 2 years. You could read many commentaries, especially the modern ones. Barbanel points this out. Rambam holds that basically, yes, Saul did not reign for such a long time. It fits with the calculation in Masechet Chagiga that the inter-sanctuary period between the end of the Shiloh period, when Eli died and the sanctuary at Shiloh was destroyed, and the construction of the temple was 57 years, and 40-something of those were in the reigns of King David and King Saul, which leaves very little time for both King David and King Solomon. Doesn't leave much time for Solomon, for Saul, or for Samuel. And they actually adjusted. As I heard from Rabbi Stav, that's just one opinion, perhaps. Just like the rest of the Seder Olam, perhaps it was longer, but that's just a calculation you get from the basic understanding of Psukim. But I don't believe that was such. I believe that it makes more sense that Saul even reigned for maybe perhaps 15 years after David was anointed. From David probably was anointed, he was still too young to go to war. His brothers were old enough to be drafted. Remember, age 20 is draft age. And if his older brother was the minimum draft age, let's say, well, it says his third brother. The third brother was already drafted, was age 20, and David was the youngest. So if Yishai had a son every year, it would make David 15, perhaps even younger when he was first anointed. And he was not tried as a soldier back then. And David grew into his role as a soldier later. And then he finally reigned at the age of 30. So yeah, we have a few years. Based on what I wrote previously, Samuel should have told Saul that, you have to quit now. And Saul should have been strong enough to accept this, but Saul could not. This is something that he had a very hard time with. And we have this situation now that the last few years of Saul's reign, Saul is basically going crazy. That's what the words mean. He has a evil spirit from before the Lord is tormenting him, and he needs to calm down a lot. He eventually tries to kill his own son-in-law. His own family realizes this. His own son objects to this. His own son protests. When Saul ordered the execution of the priests at Nov, none of his underlings wanted to do so. They realized the king was mad in this respect. When Saul chased after David, he used to be able to muster many more people for his campaigns. For his campaigns against David, he could only get the minimum and the younger people to do it with him, because they realized this is not something right. The king has something wrong with him. And I believe this was necessary. Why? So that eventually, when Samuel made his prophecy public, he had to eventually tell. He's not allowed to tell people no. He had to eventually tell his students, his prophetic school, and others, why David is so important, and that he had anointed David in God's name to be the next king. Word started getting out. And even we see that people in the south of Judah, Abigail, who was originally Nabal's wife, but eventually became David's wife after Nabal's death, she even told David, when the time comes for you to be king, as God has said about you, because the word got out. Samuel had to tell everybody. In order for this to be accepted, for people to understand that Saul had to be replaced, Saul had to go through a period where the people see that Saul is no longer fit to be king, because at the time that it was first told to the prophet that Saul was to be replaced, it was far from obvious. On the contrary, most people would probably have a hard time accepting such a message, because it was so different, because it was so unbelievable. So Saul had to go through this. And perhaps also, like I've written, this is a good example of perhaps, God willing, when our monarchy is restored, even perhaps before the Messianic era, we understand that even though a person is chosen as king, even though he has the right to reign, the Torah way of replacing a monarch is for the monarch to realize, either through the advice of Torah sages, hopefully a prophet who can go and tell him, no, sorry, you need to step down, you need to be replaced perhaps by the next best man, perhaps your own son, whatever it is. And we actually even do have a precedent for that. That's King Uzziah / Azariah, who thought of himself too highly and even wanted to take some of the priesthood. And the priest stood up against him, and then he suddenly received the ultimate sign from God that he was wrong. He became a leper, and he retired after that and let his son take his place. That's the one example we have of a king who allowed for a peaceful transition of his own, peaceful transition, even during his own lifetime, because he realized he had done wrong. So too, that's what Samuel should have done, and that's what Saul should have done. And eventually we see that Saul refused so much, by the end, God brought about that he and his 3 sons all had to die on the same day in battle with the Philistines, because the time had come for David to be king. Jonathan was more than ready to allow David to reign in his stead. Jonathan realized that, but Saul did not. Saul had to keep fighting, and that eventually was his downfall. Hopefully this Parashat Zachor will learn lessons about proper Jewish leadership. We pray that even though we've had a 3rd election, same result as last time, there's not going to be. This is going to be 4th election. It's we are stuck in a political limbo. I pray that we get a proper leadership that is both endorsed by God and fulfills the Torah and helps the people keep the Torah, makes Israel a good example of morality to the outside world, and does its job in protecting us from those external threats, from those who would sooner eradicate Israel than take care of their own children. And we'll take this to heart. We'll let the prophets only wrote these books so that we learn the lessons then. The exemplary individuals were there to teach us what to do. Sometimes we're shown do like they did. Sometimes we're shown don't do like they did. In these cases, unfortunately, we have to read sometimes about their mistakes so that we can learn from them. Have a Shabbat Shalom, and don't forget, like, share, and subscribe. Send your questions and comments. And thank you for all those of you who purchased Haggadah Pesach. Please see the websites about ordering more. They're going on sale, God willing, after Purim in both the States and here in Israel. Look in bookstores for it. Tell your friends, or you can get it directly from me. And have a good one.